here. My name is Linda Duke. I'm the director of the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art here at K-State. And we are very proud to be one of several organizers of this program today, which is held in conjunction with the two museum exhibitions that you see titled on the screen behind me. I want to mention several other organizations and people who have been key in making this happen. I want to mention our curator, Eileen Wang, who has shepherded these exhibitions into being, and a wonderful staff at the museum. I want to thank Leadership Studies for opening their facility to us this afternoon. This isn't something they do all the time on weekends. In fact, almost never, so we're really grateful for that. I want to thank Global Campus here at K-State for helping us make connections with some of the community colleges in other parts of the state. We are confirmed that Dodge City Community College is joining us this afternoon. Welcome, Dodge City audience. It's possible that Pratt Community College will also come online. I'm not sure that's been confirmed yet. And possibly Seward Community College in Liberal, although they may have to be watching this at a later date. So for when we get to the part where we have Q&A after our distinguished panelists have spoken, I want to encourage people to come to the mic here to make comments and questions so that the distance audiences will hear what you say. And Zui Matre from the Beach Museum of Art will be standing by to read into the mic questions that come from our distance audience members. Lastly, I just want to mention that this is an event that's being videotaped and webcast, and the understanding is we had signs on the door, and your presence here means that you agreed to that, so feel free to leave if you're not comfortable with that. And now it's my great honor to introduce our Vice Provost for Diversity, Zelia Wiley. Thank you, Dr. Wiley.
Good afternoon. I'd just like to thank everyone for being here. We have representatives from the K-State community. We have our Junction City community, Manhattan community. And so this just really shows the interest of this great panel discussion that we plan to have today. I'm the interim associate provost for diversity here at K-State, and it's such an honor to serve in this role and serving our community. I came here from the College of Agriculture, where I served in a very similar role as Assistant Dean and Director of Diversity Programs, and there for over 12 years with the only diversity programs office of its kind in the Big 12. So I'm really appreciative of my experiences to be here today and to be invited to be the moderator. I mean, this is truly an honor to be part of this great occasion. Today we have a distinguished panel. And from the panel, when invited to moderate this, our Office of Diversity, we are providing leadership for the university as well as working with various resources throughout the university when it comes to diverse issues. Because for us to have diversity and to move forward in working together for cultural sensitivity and cultural competence, we have to have inclusion. And I think bringing the awareness of topics as such is one thing to get us into that mode, because we have to understand difference so we can move forward and appreciate those differences to understand how we do work together. So now I would like for our panel to introduce themselves, and plus my voice is really going, as you can tell. The allergies are something with the burning of our beautiful prairie, but we do need that for our prairie as well as our livestock. So our panel will introduce themselves, and then after Dr. Dandaneau will start the panel discussion. So I would like for our panel to start. Would you like to? Thank you, Dr. Dandaneau.
I'm Roger Shimomura. I'm the artist that's having a show right now over at the Beach Museum. I'm a retired professor from KU. Rock chalk.
Shocking. I'm Stephen Dandaneau. I'm the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Studies here at Kansas State University. I'm also a member of the faculty in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work, and I'm here to discuss an interest I have in Milton Eisenhower. I'll share a little bit more about that momentarily.
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Hirokazu Kosaka. I'm an artistic director at the Japanese American Culture Center in Los Angeles. I'm with Wakana Kimura, who is also an artist who helped guide me to the curation on the Toyo Miyatake photograph exhibition here at the museum. I'm fortunate to be here because I have known Linda Duke for many years.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Dandaneau, would you like to get us started?
Well, thank you, Dr. Wiley, and good afternoon, everyone. Many of you, probably most of you, know that Kirk Schultz is the 13th president of Kansas State University. But did you know that the 9th president of Kansas State University, whose name I mentioned a moment ago, played a very important leadership role for a time in the internment of citizens of Japanese ancestry and others during the Second World War? In other words, were you aware that an important leader of our university was intimately involved at the highest level in one of the most unfortunate tragedies that ever occurred in the United States? It's an interesting and important connection, and that's what I'd like to reflect on just for a bit by way of introduction to our principal speakers. Many of us have walked past, if not inside, taking courses inside of this building. When I first came to K-State, I assumed that it was named for this fellow. Yeah, I did. I had myself gone to Eisenhower Elementary School in Michigan, and we all know that Dwight David Eisenhower, who was born in Texas but raised in Abilene, Kansas, was one of the most distinguished Americans. For many reasons, we recall that he went from a staff general at the beginning of the Second World War and had a meteoric rise to become the supreme commander of Allied forces in the European theater in a very, very short time. And then after the war, served as president of Columbia University and was elected president of the 34th president of the United States in 1952 and again in 1956. We recall these things. We may not so readily recall that he also, during all that time, was a great advocate for peace, for a critic of military spending, was someone who sent federal troops on behalf of integration in the Little Rock school system in Arkansas, and who concluded his presidency, as some of you will know, with a rather dramatic farewell address given from the Oval Office. For those of you who've never heard it, you can YouTube it and watch him deliver it again and again, which called attention to the so-called military-industrial complex, which was his way of talking about insidious forces in the United States that were diminishing civil liberties and suppressing democracy. Dwight David Eisenhower. It's not the guy the hall's named after, folks. It's his younger brother, Milton Stover Eisenhower, who, in addition to being the 9th president of this extraordinary university, also born and raised in Abilene, not very far from here at all, a student, an undergraduate student at Kansas State University, graduated in 1924. He studied journalism, stayed on to teach a bit, went off to Washington, as it turned, well, first to Europe as a member of the Foreign Service, and then later he became an important figure in Washington circles as a staff member in the Department of Agriculture in particular. He got there because President Jardine, a famous name, for those of you here on campus in Manhattan, we'll recognize Jardine, became the Secretary of Agriculture. And he and younger Milton had a very good working relationship. Milton ended up working for him in the Department of Agriculture, and through the years rose to be the highest ranking civilian administrator in the department. It's an important department, working for Democratic and Republican secretaries. here's how he became involved in this episode in American history. So Milton was extraordinarily talented, very bright fellow, and he impressed everyone with whom he worked, it seemed. And that included people very different than him. One of those secretaries of agriculture was Henry Wallace, who's not perhaps well known today among a lot of folks, including younger people, but was a really important figure in American history. He became Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second vice president. And politically speaking, he was far to the left of Bernie Sanders. He was very far to the left, that's my point. And yet Milton, a lifelong Republican, a conservative fellow really in so many ways, worked very well with Secretary Wallace. And through that relationship became also a confidant of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and everyone's heard of him. Indeed, FDR and Milton Eisenhower had private lunches many a time in the Oval Office. And during that time also, the older brother was becoming known to the world. And for various reasons, there's this situation where Milton's doing some work on behalf of the president in Tennessee. He's summoned an emergency meeting in the White House on March of 1942. So approximately 4 months or 3.5 months after the direct U.S. involvement in the Second World War. And he walks into the Oval Office, and the president, in a grim manner, directs him to represent him as the head of the War Relocation Authority, essentially the civilian arm of what was this grandiose process of removing citizens and other persons of Japanese ancestry who had done nothing wrong from their homes to centers or concentration camps that had been established or were being established. And Milton Eisenhower, who I want to tell you, I think, in my opinion, is a good guy, said, "Yes, sir," and went about to do that work. And he did so for a few months' time only, though, because when he went out west to California, which was as you probably all know from your studies of history, then by that point declared a military zone and was under very much the control of military leaders, not all of whom were racist, but the ones who were in charge were, very much so. And Milton had to work with them, and they really had more power than did he in this wartime circumstance. And the same was true of the governors of all the Western states with whom he was to negotiate about the resettlement. And that's a pretty anodyne word for what was actually happening, of all these citizens and other persons who had done nothing wrong. They too were overtly and openly racist in their understanding of the situation. They spoke in those terms, and they were very hostile toward the very idea of their states, except for the Colorado, of their states playing host to these undesirable people. And this took a toll on Milton Eisenhower, and after a relatively short time, about 3 months, he found a way to resign and leave that post, and he found his way here back to Manhattan pretty soon thereafter and became the president of this institution and did all kinds of wonderful things, I might add. During that time, he created an amazing general education program modeled on what was then new and very innovative at the University of Chicago. He created an Institute of Citizenship, which is in many ways the precursor of the Staley School of Leadership Studies in which we're sitting. He's more famous perhaps for being president of Penn State University, where he served a longer period of time, and also Johns Hopkins University. Let's get that face off there. There's Dr. Eisenhower. Actually, doctor is a bit of a misnomer. He had only earned his undergraduate degree from K-State doing all these things. He was given an honorary doctorship once by Jardine, when he was president of Wichita State. And there he is at Johns Hopkins. You know, he's a powerful guy who served all the presidents who followed his brother in office up until his own passing in 1985. Anyhow, so what to say about all this? Here's what I would think. Milton Eisenhower is usually regarded when he's thought of at all, when we think about this period, this time in American history, as I said, a kind of a good guy. He, after all, he hated what he was doing. He said he lost a lot of sleep, and he tried to get out of it as soon as possible. And he did everything he could, which was pretty limited, to mitigate the circumstances, to make things better for those whose lives he was helping to upend and overturn. And he probably had this perspective and this ability because he was raised in a good home in Abilene, because he had studied journalism here at K-State, and that is a very cosmopolitan field of study, bringing you into relationship with public life, because he had spent time abroad in Scotland as a member of the diplomatic corps, you know, because a lot of factors, because he was the kind of person who could interact well with people who differed with him, like a Secretary Wallace, Vice President Wallace, or President Roosevelt. People really different than he. He respected them, understood them, learned how to work with them. He had this quality. Here's the thing, though, and I think, well, you know, and Dwight Eisenhower is the guy who opposed the use of atomic weapons in Japan, openly. The military leader criticized the military for its overreaching in terms of budgets, in terms of political influence. That's Dwight David Eisenhower. So there was something about these Eisenhowers that allowed them to have this balanced approach. However, that said, when President Franklin Roosevelt said to him, essentially, Milton, I want you to go and undermine the US Constitution and violate the basic values of our society as a means, presumably, of defending that society, which was in fact what he was being asked to do, he did not say, no, Mr. President, under no circumstances will I do that. In fact, not only am I resigning, I'm going to go out and use all my abilities, which were very considerable, and I'm going to oppose you in any way I can, despite the fact that it's wartime, there's great hysteria, and the very people, many of whom are leading our country or in positions of high authority, generals, governors, are highly racist people, filled with hate and fear, and who said in public things like, imagine a three-letter word for a person of Japanese ancestry. A three-letter word is a three-letter word. And that's the justification for what we have to do. I mean, imagine a Nazi saying, here's a three-letter word used to refer to people of Jewish ancestry or descent or belief. A three-letter word is a three-letter word. Well, this is what we were dealing with. Milton did not oppose all that. He didn't have that inside of him. He wasn't himself such a person, but what he lacked, and he's such a good person, I think if he were here today, he would say the same thing. What he lacked and what we need to cultivate as students, as faculty, as citizens, is the ability to be the person who says no to that, who doesn't participate at all in that, and in fact, who opposes it and makes no excuses. After all, we should learn from history. We should learn from people who had an ambivalent situation and did their best. We don't have to repeat that. We can be better than that. I was invited, I think, to speak, not because I'm an expert, not because I have great insight, but because I think through Milton Eisenhower's deep and enduring connection to this institution, we all perhaps have a special connection to this history, to this subject matter, and therefore a special obligation to do better. Thank you.
I have a story that just popped in my head as I was listening to your talk that involves KU. When I was teaching years ago, a student stopped by my office and said, I understand you do a lot of work, creative work having to do with the incarceration of World War II. And I said, yes. And he says, well, did you know that KU was somewhat involved in that? And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, let me show you this letter I found in the archives. And he showed me this letter. And what had happened was that there were two Japanese-American Nisei, meaning second generation, they were American citizens born in this country, had applied to KU for admissions because of the camp situation back in Seattle. And they knew that they would have to go to these camps. However, there was a window of opportunity for them to leave the Pacific Northwest and go eastward. And since there were students at the University of Washington, they wanted to go someplace where they could finish their college education. And one of the places that came up for them was KU. And so they wrote a letter to the chancellor of KU and said, would you accept us so we can continue our studies? And the chancellor at KU wrote back and said, of course, we welcome you with open arms. It's all sounded great so far. But the letter that the student showed me was from the Board of Regents. It was a copy of a letter the Board of Regents sent to these two young men that said, absolutely not. The president is not the one that has the last word on this, and we will not accept you for further studies here. So it's a rather unhappy ending to that story, particularly to one that was so interested in learning more about camp. The other night, when I drove back to Lawrence after the opening of the painting exhibition, I was on Facebook about midnight. And there was an article that had come out about an incident that happened at Camp Minidoka, the site of Camp Minidoka, all the way back in December. And for some reason, 4 months later, it was just getting out. So this is actually very fresh news. Camp Minidoka, the concentration camp that I was a part of, was right next to a very, very small town called Hunt, Idaho. It was actually an official small town, had its own mailbox. And so a lot of the people that were in Minidoka referred to where they were at as Hunt. And particularly among the incarcerees themselves, they would all refer to camp as Hunt. And it was also known as the Hunt Camp. Now, the news broke out just recently that back in December, in Twin Falls, which is about 18 miles from Minidoka or Hunt Camp, that a new Islamic center of Twin Falls was being constructed. And because they were having a difficult time raising funds to complete the project, they had temporarily put plywood over the windows and the doors so that no one could break in. And somebody at one point in December came in and spray painted the word Hunt Camp over the plywood panels. And then immediately the Muslim American community came and removed the sign and all evidence of that vandalism. But they did get photographs which were posted on Facebook. Obviously, whoever did this saw these similarities between the Japanese-American situation in 1940s to what the Muslim Americans were going through. And what I want to do is to share some paintings with you that were sort of a response, my response to some of these situations. And the first situation that I want to talk about or refer to is the attack on the World Trade Center, 9/11. And I want to read you a little statement that I wrote that accompanies the painting. It's an acrylic painting done in 3 panels, and it's 6 feet high and 12 feet wide. Just recently acquired by the Baltimore Art Museum for their permanent collection. The painting is called Not Pearl Harbor, and what inspired me to do this was because when the attack happened, it seemed that everyone was comparing it to Pearl Harbor, and naturally it made members of that community a little nervous, constantly hearing Pearl Harbor all over again. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, I was preparing to take my wife to the Kansas City airport to catch a plane to LaGuardia Airport. I turned on the TV just as reports were coming in that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. Then within minutes, I watched the second plane hit, and I knew my wife would not be going to New York. Within hours, comparisons were being made to the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. When hearing this parallel, it didn't take long to think about what ultimately happened to the Japanese Americans following this attack, and what could happen to other innocent Americans should this attack be proven to be an act of terrorism. The idea to do a major painting on this subject began to germinate. During times of national crisis, the American government has shown the ability to forget lessons learned from past history. In 1941, due to wartime hysteria, the attack on Pearl Harbor ultimately led to the wrongful imprisonment of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry. Earlier events like the Iran hostage crisis of 1979 and Operation Desert Storm, 1991, spawned paranoia resulting in excessive police surveillance and Muslim bashing rhetoric. The Trade Center attack, with its comparisons to Pearl Harbor, rekindled serious interest among some segments of American society to suspend the rights of all practicing Muslims and innocent people of Arab descent in an attempt to ferret out the guilty elements. The painting, Not Pearl Harbor, depicts many of the main characteristics and historical events related to and resulting from the attack on the World Trade Center, and is meant to stimulate dialogue on whether mistakes committed in 1942 could possibly be repeated today. The prevalent smoke that covers the painting emanates from the World Trade Center in the lower center of the painting. I hope you can see that or identify it. The 2 left panels, and when I refer to panels, I mean vertically. The painting is divided into 4 vertical panels. The 2 left panels depict historic events from the Middle East, while the right 2 panels depict issues related to the attack on Pearl Harbor. In total, the painting is intended to ask the question, just how far have we come in exercising good judgment where racial profiling and religious tolerance is concerned? So it's a little hard for me to see that. The issue, I think it's clear from the issues on the right 2 panel depict everything going from the actual attack on Pearl Harbor at the bottom in the opening between the black clouds to the top that the war ends in the bombing of Japan with atomic weapons. And right in the middle is the monument to Pearl Harbor that exists in Hawaii today. And in the exact middle of the painting are, and this has made some museum people a little nervous when the possibility came up about exhibiting this painting, because there are 2 stereotypes. But One is a stereotype of a Japanese soldier on the right, and the other of a Middle Eastern person on the left. George Bush, who was president at the time, and Franklin Roosevelt, who was president of America at the time. And then on the left, some references to Guantanamo, to the Iran hostage crisis, a close-up of from the pilot's deck in the upper left-hand corner, just about ready to impact the World Trade Center. Osama bin Laden in the lower left. And the Trade Center in the lower bottom being attacked on the right by Japanese Zeros, and on the left by the US airliner. So that painting, let's see, was done in 2012. And then just recently, because of all of the stuff we've all been hearing coming from the presidential elections, I was moved to, I'm going to show you 3 examples. This is one of a theme that I've worked with in the exhibition over at the Beach Museum, classmates. In this case, I updated it by including a person of Muslim faith also being treated in the same way as. This series came from a visit I made to the Bainbridge Island Museum. And Bainbridge Island was the first city in America or on the West Coast where the Japanese Americans were evacuated to the camps. And I went to their museum, and they had a photograph of a Bainbridge Island High School yearbook from 1941, and then they had one of 42, and the senior class was absolutely void in 1942 of any Japanese Americans. And the population of Japanese Americans on Bainbridge Island is actually quite significant. And that struck me so much that I went back and did the first of about 6 variations I've done of this theme of classmates. So, but this is the first painting I did that included a Muslim woman. This one is called American Citizens. It's a move to the camps. A very obvious tongue-in-cheek situation here. All you have to do is look at the suitcases that they each carry. So this is more of a symbolic entrance or inclusion into the camp experience. And then the last painting I want to show you, I don't think needs any explanation. Okay. Thank you very much.
Again, my name is Hirokazu Kosaka. I was born in Can you hear me? No? I was born in Japan. My home is 800-year-old monastery. It's a Buddhist sanctuary for many of the monks, and still sustain the 800-year-old edifice. I came to Los Angeles in the 60s, but later I came as a minister of the local temple in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. There I met many of the Japanese Americans who have been interned in the 40s. Myself, I am called MacArthur children. I was born after the war, and many of the children were called MacArthur because of the General MacArthur period. So we were called the MacArthur kids. When I was a minister at the local temple, We had a congregation of about 1,500 families. And within the 1,500 families, many of our service, from funeral to the memorial service, was held. And my job was to do certain things. One was when the funeral was done, the funeral were the first generation of Japanese American immigrants. The family were second generation, and this second generation was not able to read or write Japanese characters because of a certain period of their lives. They were not to speak the Japanese language. So my job was to translate them. I would go to their home after the funeral, and things that need to throw away or things not to keep. And many of them was suitcases. The suitcase, which I found in the garages of their homes, were many stories inside. I think one of the very interesting things was the front of the suit, these steam trunks had a stamp of a port of the Japan, Yokohama, Kobe, these labels on it. And right next to it, there were labels of camps. And it just came back to Los Angeles and was there maybe perhaps 50 years, wanted to go back to Japan again. And present time, I have 600 of these suitcases. I had it in my home, but today it's sitting in Japanese National Museum in Los Angeles. About 20 years ago, as a minister, a Buddhist priest, I wanted to send these suitcases back. And so I asked one of the container ship company to support me to send this suitcase back spiritually. So I sent it back to Japan in a Buddhist temple. It was sitting there for a few months, and it came back again. And it's a quite a kind of heartwarming project that I executed. And many of the families in Japan also came to say hello to the suitcase. But I think within the suitcase itself, it had this incredible story, kind of a metaphor of impermanence. When someone asked me, what is Buddhism? I think scholarly or from the Buddhist part, I would say impermanence of all things. And another word that I like to use is interdependent origination. It happens when something's next to you. You cannot define a person without something else. I think it becomes Einstein relativity, in fact. The Buddhism had already thought about this already 2,500 years ago. And the fear of this suitcase, I could really feel the space within it. It had memories of their life in Japan, memories in the camps, and then I think struggled to come back. And I think the word fear in certain Buddhist thought is about egoless mind, and it's about this Japanese word, shikata ga nai. I heard it all through my ministry here, even Japan, shikata ga nai. It's literally translated, it cannot be helped. So when I called 3/11, March 11 was a disaster in Tohoku, Japan, the big earthquake, 9-point earthquake. And when I call friends in Japan, they would say, oh, shikata ga nai, it can't be helped. And I think I heard these words all through my ministry in Buddhist temple in Little Tokyo, where many people said, well, it could not have been helped. And I think perseverance of Japanese have this particular word too, called gaman. And I think these two words signify what Japanese, we call the silent people of Los Angeles. There were no activists, they didn't say a word. They packed their suitcase in less than 48 hours and moved on. I have many, many friends who were fishermen in Los Angeles. They had more than 300 ships, and they were not able to sell it, or they were not able to take it with you to the camp. And they were given away, or some of them were upset, and they burned it in the Pacific Ocean. There were many, many stories like that, and if you come to the museum, you'll see what Toyo Miyatake took photographs, or really it signifies that particular time. And I mentioned in the exhibition, Roger and I talked about one of the photographs. It had a fish market in Manzanar. And what in Manzanar is a desert, almost 4 or 5 hours from Los Angeles. These friends of fishermen, the Japanese high school kids, friends from high school, they kind of stole their father's truck and they load tuna, sardines, mackerel in their iced trucks, and they brought it for them. And that's kind of a cool thing to do, a high school kid, borrowing father's truck and bringing them to their friends. And those kind of sentiment is in the exhibition. Please come and see it. It's quite heartwarming. It's not so much about angriness or fear. It's about life in the camps. There were 3 documenters, Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lang. And you could see different type of style of how they document the internment camp. It's quite a beautiful photographs. Please come and enjoy. Okay, thank you.
Thank our panelists. I think it was very informative. And here at Kansas State University, this program is truly reaching our goal, how we want our audiences, our community to understand that we are truly embracing diversity. And through 3 departments, we're really working hard through Student Life, the Office of Institutional Equity, as well as the Office of Diversity, to continue to embrace diversity by information, increasing the awareness. So this particular seminar today, or program, has been very enlightening, and now it's time for you to be engaged. Engaged to ask your questions. We also have the opportunity that we have in the wonderful world with the internet, that we have our satellites that are actually going to have an opportunity. They can ask questions, and we get the email right here and have the question asked. But you here in the audience, whatever questions that you have, please come to the mic, and we're ready to invite the dialogue. Thank you.
Ready? Yes. Russ Hutchins, Lawrence, Kansas, Osher Institute. My question for the 2 gentlemen that just spoke. Did the public in the 1940s, like churches, minority groups, civil groups, stand up and speak out against this horrible situation of internment of American Japanese?
You're asking if they spoke out back then?
Yes, in the 40s.
Well, I know that at Minidoka there was a pastor of the all of the various Buddhist church, the Baptist church, Episcopalian. They all had their own churches with Japanese congregations. And they were all, of course, very supportive and assisted in the physical move to the camps, and actually made periodic visits and then assisted the relocation after the war, which was in some ways more difficult than the move to the camps, because it was not a welcoming environment. It seemed like most of the communities in Seattle, where I'm from, felt like things had improved without having the Japanese Americans around. And so we were greeted with signs that, no Japs allowed, no Japs here for any reason, and so on. So the ministers, and there's one in particular from the Japanese Baptist Church that was Reverend Andrews, that was known as a hero amongst the people that offered their assistance, because he sacrificed so much to help in the relocation after the camps. But there were other groups as well that stood up for the Japanese. But that whole period is described as wartime hysteria, and that's exactly what it was, and nothing made sense, particularly from the viewpoint of the Japanese Americans. Because of the threat, I think the American people felt like they needed something to focus their fear upon, and so they pretty much accepted whatever the government said about the yellow peril. And a lot of the work that I've done in the past has to do with this issue of being able to identify the difference between Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans. And you talk to any Asian American in this country, and they'll tell you the same stories, whether they're from Japanese backgrounds, Korean, Chinese, that they're always presumed to this day still as being foreigners. And I still get asked, or get told, how did you come to speaking the language so well? I mean, that's a common occurrence. And so it's all tied into the same issue that goes back to the incarceration. And we still have a long ways to go.
Thank you, Dr. Shimomura.
We have a question from the Dodge Community College. The question is, what prospects did an American of Japanese descent have after the camps were opened?
What?
What was it?
What prospects, or what could you do once you were in the camp?
During the camp?
Yeah.
What did they
whilst
do?
being in the camp.
The question, what they do in the camp?
After the camps were opened, what were the prospects for the Americans of Japanese descent? So I'm just trying to clarify if it is after the Japanese Americans were released, or before that. It's really pronounced
It's
after release.
after release. Well, after, in 1945, many of the people came back to the origin, but many people then come back to their homes. The people who I did research on, they came back to their home, but yet the home was sort of devastated by, especially, let me tell you a little example. In East Los Angeles, present time, there is a lot of Mexican American living there. before the war, there was a Jewish community, Italian community, Portuguese community. The high school kids went to this particular school called Marshall High School. When they were rounded up to go to camp, one of the Mexican American kid kind of dressed up like a Japanese American kid and smuggled into a bus, a guy named Ralph. And he lived in the Manzanar camp for 3 years. They let him stay. But after they came back, most of the luggages that was stored was in churches and temples. It was not their home in a way, but it was a community grounds. And when they came back, that's what they, in fact, came back. But in Little Tokyo and Los Angeles, the entire streets were occupied by African Americans. And the very famous jazz groups were there. And even today, there are a lot of research on that Little Tokyo area where many of the jazz company was there. But when they came back to produce company and farming. The fishing company was all gone, and the entire fishing family were dispatched to different careers. Many of people, I think they went back to farming. And I mean, there's a lot of jokes on Japanese gardeners. Beverly Hills, kind of rich area, all of them were Japanese Americans doing gardening. Now we have entirely, the landscape have changed. Sort of Mexican Americans have taken over the landscape gardening. And you can see a difference between Japanese gardener with other groups. They're, you know, kind of bonsai kind of a landscape, and it's all gone now. So, but again, maybe Roger would know more about Seattle and other places.
There was, I don't know how many of you have read the book Hotel in the Corner of Bitter and Sweet? Bestseller, New York Times. But it's a story about the incarceration experience in Seattle during the war. And it revolves around the Panama Hotel, which is a real landmark in Seattle, because the Panama Hotel was in existence when there was a very active Japanese community in Seattle. In fact, there were a couple of blocks that were just lined with stores. It was like Tokyo recreated the markets and all of that, which of course with the evacuation just totally disappeared. And they're trying to bring that back, and I think a major contributor to that is this book called The Hotel in the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. And the Panama Hotel, our family is sort of, it's close to our family's heart, because my grandfather, when he came to this country, stayed in the Panama Hotel in 1907. And years later, towards the end of his life, he developed Alzheimer's. And he would constantly drift away, and we'd get phone calls from the police saying, you know, we've got your grandfather or relative here. Can you come pick him up? And we'd have to go across the city and, you know, pick him up. Well, one day I got a phone call. I was home, and it was the Panama Hotel. And they said, would you come and pick up your grandfather? And I said, he's at the hotel? He says, yes, he checked in. And so I got in the car and I drove to the Panama Hotel and found his room, and he was sitting on the bed. And I said, Grandpa, what are you doing here? You know, let's go. And he says, no, he says, I live here. And it was incredible to think that his entire lifetime went by and just disappeared. And he was there at the hotel. That was his first night in this country, you know. But the Panama Hotel has since been turned into a sort of a mini museum tea house, coffee shop. And the feature of the coffee shop is on the floor there's a huge sheet of plexiglass that goes to the basement of the Panama Hotel. And you can stand there and look through that plexiglass, and you can see the basement that's filled with all these old trunks. And apparently what had happened was when the war broke out and the Japanese Americans knew they were going to be evacuated, they needed someplace to store all their household goods. And the Panama Hotel that had Japanese owners said, you could store it here. And after we get out of this, you could come and pick it up. And so they brought their suitcases packed with all of their household goods, and it was all stored, stacked up in this huge basement at the Panama. And after the war, because it turned out to be longer, the evacuation process turned out to be longer than anybody anticipated. Most of the people didn't want their trunks and just said, throw it out. Well, the owner kept it, of course, and turned it into this museum, virtually a museum with this plexiglass floor. So if you're ever in Seattle, go to the Panama Hotel and the coffee shop, and you can see this for yourself, along with all the displays of stuff that they have in there related to Japanese and Japanese American history in Seattle.
Like a lot of things, we tend to forget about them in history. It's not that long ago, really. It's just yesterday that all this happened. And I would, with respect to both questions, put a good word in for Studs Terkel's book, The Good War, which is ironically titled, a set of interviews, won the Pulitzer Prize many, many years ago, but kind of recollects what was happening during the Second World War, and I think brings it to life in a very vivid way, and it's a lot more complicated than almost everyone realizes. A lot more complicated. And recently I've been reading Richard Reeves' relatively new book on the subject, and it includes a lot of anecdotes about resistance at the individual level, where people said no to this stuff, and you're not going to do that to my friend, and bring the fish out to the camp, but people actually opposing this stuff. But on the ground, leadership, public leadership opposing these things, there was virtually none, except from, and we often forget this too, the political left, the labor movement, people who themselves would very soon thereafter become the object of scapegoating and attack during the McCarthy period. Those sort of folks always played a major role in the advancement of civil rights, the critique of white supremacy. They always did, because for various reasons, theoretically, they were inclined in this direction. They saw political interest in it as well, and so on. Well, we tend to forget all that, but no major mainstream leaders that in fact, it's all irony. Earl Warren, the future Supreme Court Chief Justice, was at the time in California the Attorney General, and he absolutely supported this, absolutely. Later he would, be one of the 9 people on the Warren Court to uphold the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision, Brown versus the board, the Warren Court. That man was, just a few years before that, an advocate for what happened. And the Supreme Court ruled at the time, famously, that it was not unconstitutional, that this was a constitutional act. We all know that's not true. It wasn't true then. It was later overturned. It took till the Carter administration for a formal apology to be given on behalf of all the people of the United States, and some limited compensation. But it's just, there were people in Nazi Germany who stood up too. They were average people. They weren't leaders very often. There's always some resistance, but we tend to forget that. What we need is, that such situations never come to be in the first place. And that would require a very broadly educated citizenry that during a time of hysteria were resistant to the hysteria.
There's a question for Dr. Dandaneau. What is the name of the second book that you mentioned after the first was The Good War? The second question, the second
What
book.
is the title of that book? Can you say? I can't hear you. Oh, yeah, that's right. It's called Infamy by Richard Reeves.
I wonder if any of the speakers would like to talk about the concept of shame, both as maybe a reflex that acts as a warning sign when people foresee that emotions are rising and there's something shameful. And also in terms of those long-term and very difficult attempts to deal with a past that for a whole very large group are accepted as shameful. I'm particularly interested from a religious perspective, how shame is evoked in to reconstruct or try to construct a new history.
I think shame becomes sort of, in the Buddhism sector, a kind of a cause and effect. Japanese tend to be shameful for everything. It's because the Buddhism have this particular word dukkha, which is a suffering, and it's sort of a cause and effect. And again, there is no one particular entity. When you say shame, there is bipolar opposition. There are words that connotes that shame. And Japanese cultural, and especially the first generation who came to America, have this particular language, the cultural difference between my generation to that particular time. I too, when I came to America to learn English, the grammatical difference was so different than Japanese language. There is no such thing as conjunction in Japanese language. It's everything is conjoined, interdependent. For example, space and time, there's a conjunction, right? A and D is a conjunction, a grammatical. So when you say space and time, you have two entities. But Japanese, we call kukan, it's one word without conjunction. And I think the word shame too it connotes with the different other sources, not just one or two. My discipline was in Sanskrit in Hinduism, and there's a word called karipisu. Karipisu is a drink that Japanese kids drink, sweet drinks. I don't think not many people know that is a Sanskrit word. Like you wearing orange, and that's a Sanskrit. It's not an English word. So this particular drink, it signified a different taste bud. So this word karipis means all kinds of different taste. I want that drink. I taste it, reciprocate it. It's cold, it's sweet, it's good, and I want some more. And so Japanese language or Japanese culture words are similar to that. It signifies this incredible sort of ambulates the word. It doesn't really say this is that, but it can be. And so I want to kind of trying to put this thing together. I have a series called Veranda series. And Veranda is, again, a Sanskrit word. It is a space between exterior and interior. It is not black or white, but infinite shades of gray. And so it's not yes and no, but infinite maybes. So again, Japanese or this kind of particular Buddhist culture is sort of fragmented for you. And I think the internees have this incredible fragmentation, how to approach this space. It's like tea ceremony. When you approach this space, it is very, very fragmented for you. You take all your weapons and leave it outside, and the stepping stones are jagged, dangerous, and you go into this incredible humble space. It takes maybe 5 minutes to get into a very short distance. But I think approach and observation of a language become an incredible a cultural difference in how you look at shame in Japanese respect. It might be happiness, the counterpart of the language. And I think the Japanese people have this incredible perseverance of the language. And so they're able to circumambulate the word shame and to say, oh, it's happiness, this and that, and it becomes totality of this void. We call it oneness. So you and I, we don't have a conjunction between you and I. So Muslims and Buddhism and Christianity, we don't have conjunction between A and D. So everything is oneness, and we call that void. It becomes difficult because I'm using English language to define this particular word. But again, most of the Japanese culture is circumambulating, and it doesn't say yes and no. So the American businessmen have a hard time going to Japan because Japanese businessman was not say yes and no. It says maybe, 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 constant maybe, and finally it's something else and doesn't mean nothing. So that's my approach to your question.
There's a saying in Japan that the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And what is it in Japanese?
What's that?
How do you say that?
What's that?
The nail that sticks up gets hammered down?
Yeah. Again, not okay. Eh?
Well,
Yeah, it's okay.
yeah, it's not important. And when you compare that to the American way, which is closer to the squeaky wheel, is the one that gets the oil. They're exact opposites almost. And so this topic always comes up when we talk about politics and we talk about activism, that the way that Japanese went around getting things done from a political standpoint and the way that Americans do are quite different. And I think the way the Japanese did it was reflected upon the second generation that were, the teenagers in camp. And they tended to be more on the quiet side, especially when you compare it to their counterparts, the Caucasians in this society. And really the reparations for the camps was primarily activated by Sansei, my generation, and I'm third generation. And my generation learned from pretty much the black movement in this country, which is the squeaky wheel, is the one that gets the oil, speaking out. And so anyway, I think hopefully that addresses some of the original question.
I would say that Eisenhower was regretful about the actions that we took as a country and that he regretted his own participation in them, which is different than being ashamed, which would reflect an internalization of recognition of dishonor, that we were highly dishonored, that he was a dishonorable person for having done what he did. I don't know, I've never seen evidence of that. Certainly regret, and certainly action then taken to try to create situations where such actions wouldn't happen again. But not, shame is it's a different thing, and it's a deep and profound feeling. And I haven't seen evidence of that. It's hard to say, though, for sure.
Hi, I'm Juanita Briggs. I graduated from Kansas State. In 1962, my father was military. In 1962, we were stationed in Germany, and we were taken to a concentration camp, which was Dachau. And I've been to Dachau twice. And then when I joined the military in 1977, I was pointed to and showed the internment camps. So at that point, Dachau, or the concentration camps in Germany, was like history. It was in the past. And so was being pointed those internment camps. But those internment camps are still there. So I got the impression that they could be used again, the ones we still have in America. But what was awful to me was, when you're in a fight, it's hard to keep that up. So I don't know how the 100,000 Japanese people could be marched off to a camp, but I know as a black woman how trying to fight for your rights can beat you down, you know, in a week, so to say. Coming into the military as a woman, I had to fight with the people who were in the same uniform, same everything as me, just for a little space. The first time I reported to Fort Ord, California, I was not allowed to open my car door to put my foot on the ground. I was told, the colonel said he doesn't want you to put one boot in the company area, so you go back to transportation point and pick up a new assignment. This is in 1977. So I can see how people can be marched into concentration camps, because there is a whole machine that beats you down before you can even get to a piece of paper and make you a protest sign. And I've heard about what happened to the Japanese Americans, and I was like, wonder why there wasn't any, big movement, big protest, why the Baptist church didn't fall out and say, you can take Japanese people to the concentration camp, but you're not taking the Baptists, because everybody had somebody in the fight. But people, for whatever reason, are glad it's not them, and are happy to stand aside and let you haul whoever you want to haul off to a camp, which in this country right now, we should be closing Guantanamo Bay down in Cuba. We don't need that kind of camp where all those, I don't know how many, there's 100 or so people are there, because we don't know if they're enemy or not. They should be brought to America and put in all these prisons. We have 4 or 5 big prisons in Kansas that can hold anybody. But I know that I felt kind of helpless seeing, what went on in the concentration camps in Germany. I didn't even know about the concentration camps in Japan until after that, period. So as far as when somebody was asking you about shame, you are ashamed. When you're a person who's walking through that, you're walking through a camp, you're seeing the remnants of a camp, you're ashamed. But you think, what would I have done? Which I don't know what I would have done.
There really wasn't, there were Japanese Americans that decided that they weren't going to go, that this was an injustice, and they just simply were imprisoned, along with all of the ones that were under suspicion. My grandmother, who was the immigrant, who came in 1912, just before she left Japan, started a diary. And she maintained that diary. At first, she was just going to write about the trip over on a boat. She was a photo bride, and prearranged marriage with my grandfather, who had been in this country since 1906. And so this marriage was established, and my grandmother came over on a ship with 60 other photo brides. And she started a diary and continued that diary for 56 years of her entire life in this country, and chronicled all of the events, including, of course, the incarceration. She was also a midwife because she was a nurse in the Japan-Russian War. She had medical training. She became a midwife and ended up delivering over 1,000 babies in the Pacific Northwest. And I was the last baby she delivered. She came out of retirement to deliver me. So I've always had a close sort of relationship with her, not only when she was alive, but even after she passed. I did a lot of paintings that were based upon those diaries, and recently donated those diaries to the American History Museum at the Smithsonian. But she, at the outbreak of the war, my mother told me she remembers Grandma standing there reading the diaries after Pearl Harbor and burning them, throwing them in the wood-burning stove in our kitchen, because it was well known that other people that were maintaining diaries, had they made any kind of sentimental reference to Japan, you know, missing this or missing that or anything favorable about Japan, was reason enough to put them in a prison for the duration of the war. And so she was tossing diaries. So, you know, instead of having 56 diaries, I have 37, I think, and most of the missing ones were destroyed by her. So anyway.
I'll just jump in real quick. Isn't it the case, and I don't mean this facetiously, I don't keep up on some of the news as much as I should, but isn't it the case that in Kansas today, well-meaning people think that we oughtn't be accepting refugees from Syria because we're afraid of them, afraid what might occur, that some of them might be terrorists? I think that's true, isn't it, official policy? And isn't it also official policy that we don't, here in Kansas, wish to accept prisoners from Guantanamo Bay? I think the reasoning is, well, maybe that would make us a target for a terrorist attack. And not that they would escape, but that, you know, others might seek to harm us because of that action. I think that's the thinking. And so, I mean, I think we're living in a time right now where all around us right here locally, as well as on a broader scale, well-meaning leaders are articulating positions which, you know, are somewhat rooted in fear of another. And, you know, you might say, well, it's reasonable fear, it's a reasonable concern. Or you might say, no, you know, because that was what was said about the same folks who were being incarcerated and sent to camp. There was a reasonable fear, you know, I mean, we don't know. They could be. It's war. Anything practically is justified when people are afraid for their very security of their life. That's what so it seems. And so what would it take to be able to be in a position to be able to acknowledge real fear and real concerns, but yet not act in that particular way? Not treat whole groups of others, you know, what does it require? What kind of education, what kind of learning, what kind of experience is required that would permit a person to say, well, yeah, sure, there's a concern, there's a risk, but we're not doing that? That's a good question, you know, and I think it's something we as thinkers, as people who are trying to learn, really ought to attend to, because it has great practical significance.
I know we have a question coming in from our distance audience, but I just want to jump in with something in response to what's just been said, and that is, I'm not sure the power or the empowerment to act comes out of shame. Shame may be justified, but shame is not an empowering feeling. And so I think your question, Dr. Dandaneau, what do we need to cultivate in ourselves and help young people cultivate that will empower them? And I don't think it's shame. I'm not saying that's not ever justified, but I don't think that's what it takes. And I think those of us here at a university really need to give some serious thought to that question. And I thank you all for raising it.
We have a question from the Dodge City Community College from Professor Jennifer Nolan. The question is, why do we not see more comparisons between the current push against Syrian immigrants and the internment of Japanese Americans? The blind ignorance, fear, and racism seems so relevant to our current climate.
I think Americans are not, I think people in other societies have a much better understanding of their own history. I think Americans tend not to. In as much as we know anything about our own history, and forgive me, I know there's lots of exceptions. I don't mean to paint with broad strokes. I guess I do mean to paint with broad strokes. I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Americans do not study their history. They know the barest little about it. And what that means is they certainly don't meditate in a deep and spiritual way, in a historic, with a kind of rootedness even in what we might call Western humanities, or certainly not with on the basis of any sort of rigorous social science, or we just don't plumb the depths of our own experience terribly well, no matter what aspect of our history it is, even the things for which we might be rightly very proud. And so there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not a particularly individual failing. There's some broad cultural, societal reasons why this country's unusual in that respect in the world. But it does lead to a situation, as the questioner was kind of suggesting, where we're vulnerable to circumstances wherein we might be led astray because we don't have that internal knowledge and the experience acquired, not directly, but through others' experience, that would allow us to make good judgments, to have the right understandings that might then allow us to shape our raw emotions and modify them and put them in, make them work for us in such a way that allows us to deal with our problems differently. We don't draw on our history very much. So with respect to the case of, it's not, I don't want to call it history, I mean, it's just yesterday. It's with us right today. That this thing happened in our society. People don't know the barest facts about it, let alone have given any deep thought. You're kind of unusual that you've been to a camp. I haven't been able to visit one. So that is something that we really do need to address, and I think people of all sort of political sensibilities in our society tend to agree on that. One of the most outspoken advocates I've heard recently is Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who's a lifelong Republican, conservative person. She decries the fact that people in our society do not know nearly what they ought about their own history or about public life, about the workings of our government, they don't participate either. And I think some of that's changing in our own time, which is very, very exciting and welcome. But there's no real good substitute for serious study and serious reflection of our human history, whether it's thousands of years of history or whether what happened yesterday. And we can't really do without it.
You know, this whole educational process is complicated by the fact that the very victims of the incarceration have an unwillingness to talk about it. And I always remember when I was growing up, you know, hearing my parents and friends of parents talking about camp this, camp that, you know, and, you know, for all I knew it was camping, you know. But it seemed to be a place that only the Japanese Americans shared their experiences and would never talk about it when they were with Caucasian people or Caucasian friends. And I finally got to a point, and I think I was a senior in high school, and I talked to my dad, and I said, listen, I need to write this paper for English class, and I want to write about camp. And I want you to tell me everything you can about it. Because at that point, I knew it was something that wasn't good that had happened. And I had my own experiences as a child that were just kind of a blur, you know, that had mostly to do with memories of weather and things like that. And my dad's just got furious, and he said, don't ever bring that up in this house again. This is something that we're trying to forget, and we don't need you to bring it up because, you know, it could happen again. And I mean, this was the attitude I found later of not just my father, but of his entire Nisei, second generation. This is the way that they dealt with it. And I'm sure you can find, well, the word gaman that Hirokazu talked about earlier, you know, gaman, of just holding it in, and, you know, eventually, you know, you'll work this out, you'll survive, but not to any kind of resolution, intellectually or spiritually or anything else. You know, just don't talk about it, just don't deal with it, just, you know, let it go. And so, as I said, it was really my generation, the third generation, that were far more Americanized, growing up in a household that there were virtually no evidence of being Japanese, because I think my parents were deathly afraid at that point of looking too Japanese, you know, to other people, because this could happen again if Japan did something wrong, you know. And so I was, you know, pretty much everything in me that was Japanese was flushed out. And so when the movement for reparations came, reparations from the government, the big fear was that the Nisei, who failed to talk about this publicly, talk about that experience, would be asked to testify in front of public audiences, you know, conducted by the U.S. government. And reparations is going to be determined on how willing they were to finally open the door for, you know, these conversations to take place. And boy, did they open. And from what I understand from people that attended these hearings, that they were just simply unbelievable, literally the dam breaking and just gushing. And even my dad got into the spirit once. And a good friend of mine, Frank Chin, who was a writer, was living in Seattle at the time, and he was asked to write a story about the history of Japanese Americans in Seattle. And he decided to pick one family, and he picked our family. And he, starting with my grandmother and going to my dad and then to me, because there were so many events and issues within our lives that were sort of important issues and topics in Japanese America. And so Frank came over to our house, and my dad was sitting there on the couch, and I was shocked that my dad would participate in this, especially with Frank Chin, who's crazy. And And Frank started, first thing he did was he says, "Is it okay if I tape this?" And my dad said, "No tape." And I thought, yeah, that's typical, And Frank said, "Can I take notes, writing notes?" And my dad said, "That's okay." And so then Frank started asking questions, and what were you doing on Pearl Harbor Day? It's something I never asked my dad. I had no idea. And so it was fascinating to hear what our family was doing, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And then, a lot of questions about camp, and my dad was answering these questions, and I was learning all these things. And then Frank said, "Were there any experiences that were particularly bad for you in camp?" And my dad said, "Yeah, there was one when we were being processed into camp." And he said, "I was holding Roger, and he was 2 years old." And he said, and we were in line to take medical or to take physicals. And a guard came up and took Roger out of my arms like this and said, "He goes in another direction." My dad said, "You're not taking him away from me," And the guard pulled my dad away in front of this big crowd and made him drop his pants and say, "You will stand there until we give you permission that we're through with your son." And my dad said, it was the most embarrassing, humiliating event of his life. Well, obvious, They took me away and gave me shots or something. Of course, I don't remember any of this. And came back and returned him to my dad and said, "You can pull your pants up again." And my dad was standing with his pants, probably 300 people around him that were in line waiting to take their medical physicals. So, and then Frank, who's just feverishly writing all this down, and then my dad said, "I don't want you to use any of that." And Frank's mouth just dropped. And he said, "That was so embarrassing, so humiliating. I don't want that on record any place." So, it was things like that worried a lot of Sansei, that things were not going to go well at the government hearings if other Nisei took that kind of an attitude, that they'll talk about things up to a certain level, when in fact beyond that level is the stuff that needed to be heard. So as it turns out, as I said earlier, the floodgates opened, all of these things were said, and eventually the reparations did happen.
I just wanted to bring up what I think is important. We're talking about, looking at what's going on today. If we look at the same sort of discrimination that we're putting on the LGBT community, and out of what seems like to me as fear as the unknown, we're using, here in Kansas, I've found out that it's legal to be fired from your job if you are gay, if your employer chooses to do so, which is crazy. And, I just think that, looking back at the past and how we treat racial and ethnic groups can also...
Step into the microphone.
That if we look at how we've treated racial and ethnic groups and just minority groups in general in the past, we can kind of expand that to where it's not just ethnic and racial groups, it's a lot more than that. It is this entire community of people who, I wouldn't be surprised if sooner or later we start seeing signs in businesses that say no gays allowed or no trans people allowed, just similarly to how we saw signs that said no Japanese, no Irish, no blacks, no Mexicans. It's the same sort of thing, but we're turning a very blind eye to it.
Right. Mississippi, that I've been paying attention to. Here's the thing. There are, you mentioned the gay, lesbian, transsexual community and so forth. There's many communities, like most of us probably, in one way or another, have identities which have in the past become the object of some sort of threatening discrimination and have inspired prejudice in other people. to really understand these things, I think would leave one dumbfounded in a sense. I mean, if you really deeply investigated, just in this country, let alone all the rest of the world, our history in this respect, you would, the result would be a kind of profound sense of the inhumanity that we can enact against one another. And you know, studying psychology and sociology and other fields, history, can really help a lot. But you know, I don't know that it seems not to have done its work, because time and again we're confronted by these same, you know, issues. There's been some progress, but lots and lots of regression, and it seems like all the progress is tenuous and could be reversed. It feels this way to many. To others feel differently. So, you know, I just acknowledge what you're saying, and it's another way of framing the challenge. There's a lot of similarities between these sort of issues, but there's differences as well that should be respected. I'm glad you brought up what you did.
Any other questions?
We've heard fear, shame, racism. My question is, what drives these? What drives racism more? Fear? Or does fear drive the racism?
Go ahead.
Maybe a couple nights ago, I did a Japanese archery purification in the museum. The notion of hitting this particular target is to kill yourself, shoot yourself. It is part of the ego. Once you have a target, your ego becomes large. You want to hit the target. For example, your question is your ego. Once I give you an answer that affirms your ego, it's like giving you a dessert. I said, wow. And that ego becomes much bigger. You question it more and more and more. And that's how I practice Japanese archery. We call it Zen archery. The target, arrow, the bow, and yourself, when these four entities becomes one without your ego, it becomes, we call it void. Again, I'm searching some words, but only word I could come up with is void. Again, in particular sector of Buddhism, like for myself, we shaved our head. We only wore black and white clothing. And from morning to night, it's meditation. Standing, walking, sitting, and to kill our ego for desire, want to know. And so it's a self-reliance that you understand your true self. And then I think you could understand what your question is all about. Again, kill yourself or shoot yourself is my practice now, even today. All through my life, I've been practicing archery, but in the archery range, my father would say, he screamed to me, he said, kill yourself, kill yourself. And that echoes in the dojo or the space. That from my archery perspective, I think.
My graduate school mentor in sociology was raised in a Jewish community in Buffalo, New York. He's 90 years old now, and so came of age during the 1930s and fought during the Second World War. He's now a Tibetan Buddhist. after years of trying to answer your question and struggle and learn from many traditions around the world, he came to this similar feeling that ultimately the deepest answers are a kind of spiritual answer, and that it requires something not quite Western, certainly, to get after it. I'm not a very good student of his in that respect, since I've never been able to achieve that sort of perspective, but I certainly respect the hard work and intense study that's gone into it. It doesn't mean that he's not, as I'm sure most of us are, deeply aware of all the sort of conventional tools, conceptual tools that we teach here at the university that allow people to be enlightened. But he feels that they're inadequate ultimately to the task, and that we have to pursue that sort of course of action.
Any other questions? What about from the distant world?
Can you take one more? Have any questions?
Yes, one more.
There is one more.
Is that okay?
So this is actually not my question. This came from one of the students. What can younger generation do to stop what happened to Japanese Americans then to happen again today and stop fear-mongering?
I'm impressed with young people in this country today and in other countries. I feel that there's evidence before us of a great deal more engagement, understanding, and a deeper concern and caring for others, and a kind of acquired knowledge about the diversity that's truly part of our world. You find among younger people just far less, far less, true prejudice or recourse to ready and stereotypical understandings. Young people seem to me, by young I mean under 45, are terribly invested in, I think, a belief that we can achieve a truly more democratic society, a more peaceful existence between ourselves, and then our real problems are climate change and things like that, which require a very different kind of feeling. So I'm relatively optimistic. It's unlike me.
Okay, so
I don't know if this has anything to do with this subject, but everybody in here should be registered to vote. Everybody in here who lives with people, they should be registered to vote. Your town, because you need to vote these people out who are not carrying out the will of the people. And we can't have, I was shocked at this last election. We had 4% turnout. This is caucusing in some areas. Where's the other 96? I would not want 4% to decide for me, 4% of the population to decide for me what should be done, when we all can get up and go vote, anybody over 18. So that's one thing, to prevent people from experiencing prejudice. Now, I don't know what's going on in Mississippi, but I certainly wouldn't have voted in something like that, targeting a specific group, because Mississippi is a tourist state, and people want to come there to gamble, fish, whatever they do in Mississippi. I wouldn't want to exclude anybody from bringing me $1. But for what we all can do about keeping people from being marched into concentration camps, even your own brothers and sisters going to jail, is to vote for the right people who make the laws, who control the police, the county sheriff, the fire department. We have to take an interest in that. Thank you.
I think if there aren't any other questions, that might be a very good note to end on, is for everyone to be able to have a voice and for us to be the voice. The title of today is You People, Mistrust of the Other. I truly think we have engaged in a healthy dialogue. But for us to say you people, that's one start that can give a negative. Even the way the finger is pointing in the picture. You know, you point the one finger out, but the three are coming back. So how do we continue this dialogue? Because hopefully it has given us an opportunity to trust ourselves, to engage in a dialogue, to learn about difference. Because that is what it truly is begin. We've had a great opportunity to have, communication. I'd like to thank Dr. Dandaneau and Linda Duke for truly inviting me as the interim associate provost for diversity and the office of diversity to partner for this very, very awesome event. It's been a great event. It's been, like I say, when dialogue is healthy, it can encourage you to go to the next level and to engage in conversation. We do have a reception because one thing that is very universal or that's in common or similar is food in different cultures. So music, food, and the arts, and I hope that you go and visit the Beach Museum to visit these two exhibits. They are very, I have been there. It's just great. It is, like I said, it allows you to engage in thought because we have continued. June 7th, one exhibit, and July 31st is the second exhibit. Again, we have the reception, and the reception is the Honors College program is who we can thank for our reception today. But I would also truly like to thank, I said, the Beach Museum for allowing me to have this opportunity to be before you. I'd like to thank you, our Kansas State community, Manhattan community, Junction City, our administrators, our staff, Dr. Jackie Hartman, who I see, our Chief of Staff and Director of Community Relations. I think that's one thing in her role. We definitely have the community here today. So again, thank you. Are there any housekeeping that maybe I left out before I allow you to go and enjoy the reception? And please enjoy the reception. We do have food out there. If there's not anything else, thank you.